Nailin crossed the gully face down in mud, and none of the 7 hunters saw him do it. Above him, boots crunched on gravel. A radio clicked twice, a check-in, not an alarm. He counted the gap between footsteps, 4 seconds, then 5, then 4 again. Someone was tired. Someone was slowing down. He'd been in worse mud than this. 3 days into the final trial, and Nailin Thorne, the only human at Vorath Academy, had not eaten since sunrise. His hands were the wrong color under the grime, human pink gone grey with cold. The gully narrowed ahead into a throat of rock barely wide enough for his shoulders. If a hunter caught him here, there was nowhere to go but through. Somewhere above, a voice said his name. Not shouted, said, flat, the way you'd read a name off a list. He stopped breathing and listened. The footsteps didn't change direction. He let the air back out slow, through his teeth, and kept moving. You'd think a species built for open plains and slow patience wouldn't last 2 days on a world made for apex predators. You'd be wrong about which part of him they should have measured. 6 weeks earlier, Nailin had stepped off the transport ramp and felt Vorath's gravity settle into his knees like a hand pressing down. The air tasted like a struck match, hot metal, ozone, something mineral underneath that never quite left the back of his throat. Red light came down through a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and every cadet walking past him stood at least 2 heads taller. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. He stood at the base of the ramp for a full 10 seconds, just breathing the wrong air and letting his eyes adjust, while 3 different Vorathi handlers stared at him like he'd wandered off a supply manifest. Human, one of them finally said, checking a data slate. You're at the side table, no queue for humans. Nobody explained why. Nobody needed to. The number of humans who had ever set foot on Vorath before him was 1, and that one wasn't Nailin. He was a diplomatic gesture, a line item on a treaty nobody expected to matter. The Academy existed to train apex predators for a galaxy that ran on strength you could see. He was here because a human delegate somewhere had asked, and somebody with more patience than sense had said yes. He walked to the side table. He sat. He waited. The registration hall was carved into the cliffside itself, dark stone still warm from some engine buried deeper in the rock, and it smelled like every predator species that had ever passed through it, musk and old sweat, and something sharper underneath that made the hair on his arms stand up without his permission. Around him, cadets from 6 worlds filled out intake forms in 6 different scripts, most of them twice his height, all of them built like they'd never once had to run from something bigger. That was the part nobody at the Academy understood yet. Where Nailin came from, the frontier colonies didn't have apex status. Nothing did. The things you hunted could hunt you back, and the ones who survived long enough to grow old were the ones who learned to read ground instead of muscle. Thorne, Nailin. The intake officer, Graddock, according to the slate clipped to his chest, a Vorathi with bone ridges running down both shoulders like armor plating, waved him toward a scanning frame built for someone twice his size. Nailin stepped through it anyway. The machine hummed. Numbers scrolled up a display screen behind Graddock's head, and Graddock read them out loud, the way every cadet's numbers got read out loud, because that was tradition and nobody had thought to make an exception. Height 1.8 meters, a pause. Bone density low, reaction speed below cohort average by a wide margin. Another pause, longer this time. Pain threshold. Graddock actually stopped and looked at the number twice before reading it. Pain threshold moderate. Behind Nailin, the barracks, 3 full rows of cadets waiting their turn, went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then somebody laughed. It came from the back, loud and rolling, the kind of laugh that expected the room to join in, and most of it did. Nailin didn't turn around right away. He watched the wall behind Graddock's head instead, a long crack running through the stone like a lightning bolt frozen mid-strike, and let the laugh finish before he finally looked. The cadet laughing loudest was a Kethorn, thick-necked, arms built from what looked like larger arms stacked on smaller ones, bone ridges along his jaw sharp enough to cut. 8 feet of him, easy. He had the kind of face that had never once needed to apologize for anything, and scarred knuckles that suggested it had never needed to. 312, the Kethorn said to the cadet next to him, not bothering to lower his voice. That's how many times I've won in the yard. You know how many times a human's won anything out here? 0. Not one. Not ever. Every single one of them could kill him before he got a sentence out, and he knew they knew. Nailin sat down in the third row without a word. I'll tell you now, the numbers on that screen were the least accurate thing measured in that hall all day. He found his bunk that evening in a room built for 4, high in the cliff-face barracks where the wind came through a gap in the stone and never stopped. 2 of the 4 beds were already claimed. A Thyron cadet with pale grey fur and narrow shoulders who didn't look up from the ceiling when Nailin walked in, and an empty frame with nobody's things on it yet. He put his bag under the 4th frame, sat on the edge of the bunk, and spent the next 2 hours doing nothing anyone would have called productive. He didn't unpack. He didn't sleep. He sat and listened to the building, footsteps in the hall, the rhythm of doors which cadets came back late and which didn't come back at all, where the wind found gaps in the stone and where it didn't. By the time the lights dimmed, he could have drawn the floor plan from memory, exits included. The Thyron cadet finally spoke without turning his head. You always this quiet? Depends what's worth saying, Nailin said. The cadet's ears flicked, something like interest. I'm Finn. Nailin. Finn didn't ask why he hadn't unpacked. Nailin didn't offer. The mess hall the next morning smelled like boiled meat and something fermented, and Nailin was 3 steps from the food line when the Kethorn cadet, Brawl, someone had called him, planted himself directly in the path, close enough that Nailin had to tip his head back to find the man's eyes. Heard your reaction time, Brawl said. Heard it twice, actually. Made me want to hear it a 3rd time just to be sure. Nailin didn't step back. He measured the gap instead. The half-step of space Brawl had left open on his left side, the shift of weight onto his back foot, the kind of stance a man took when he expected someone smaller to flinch and go around. He didn't go around. He went through it, angling his shoulder into the gap Brawl had left without meaning to, and kept walking toward the food line like the conversation had already ended. Behind him, Brawl's laugh cut off half a second early. Across the hall, a Thyron cadet with narrow shoulders and sharp eyes, Sierra, Finn called her later, stopped chewing entirely and watched until Brawl finally turned back to his own table. He'd been smaller before in worse places, Nailin thought, and didn't say it out loud, and kept walking. Word got around fast in a building with thin walls. By the 2nd day, most of the barracks had decided what Nailin was: harmless, misclassified, a name they'd forget by graduation. Graddock filed the intake numbers and moved on to the next cadet without a second look. Warden Tolles, 3 floors up in an office that smelled like old paper and colder air, opened a ledger that hadn't been touched in months and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. Thorn, N. Day 1. He didn't yet know why he was starting it. He'd learn. End of part, holding 4 partition 2. Graddock paired the cadets for first field trial the next morning, and the pairing told Nailin everything he needed to know about how the academy saw him. Thorn, Finn. Graddock read the names off the slate without looking up. Preserve Sector 4. Report to the gate at first light. 2 lowest-ranked cadets sent into the same sector together. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody had to. Finn didn't complain either. He just checked his gear twice, the way someone does when they've already decided the trial doesn't matter, and fell into step beside Nailin at the gate without a word about the obvious setup. They want us to fail together, Finn said finally, once the gate had closed behind them and the preserve opened up ahead. Canyon walls the color of dried blood, scrub brush clinging to ledges, a wind that carried grit into every seam of Naylin's jacket. They want a lot of things, Nailin said. Doesn't mean they get them. 200 meters into the preserve, Nailin stopped walking. Finn kept going 3 more steps before he noticed and turned back. What? Nayland didn't answer right away. He stood still, arms loose at his sides, and listened. 10 minutes. Finn shifted his weight twice, checked the time on his wrist unit once, and said nothing else, because something about the way Nayland was standing made questions feel like the wrong move. What Nayland heard whined through the canyon, the tick of cooling rock, and under both of those, nothing. No birds, no small scavengers moving through the brush. A canyon this size should have carried a dozen background sounds, and instead it carried a hole where those sounds should have been. Something's already hunting here, Nayland said. Big enough that everything smaller went quiet an hour ago. How do you know it was an hour? Because the silence has settled. Fresh silence still has an edge to it. This one's smooth. Finn looked at him for a long moment, ears twitching, and didn't ask how a human would know the difference. He just followed when Nayland started walking again, angling toward the canyon's east wall instead of straight down its center. The ravine Nayland found 40 minutes later wasn't on any map Graddock had issued. It cut through the canyon wall at an angle, 2 meters wide at its narrowest point, walls high enough that the sky above it looked like a red ribbon. Nayland walked its length twice, running a hand along the stone, checking the wind direction, timing how long it took to cross end to end. In the open, it'll be untouchable, he said, half to himself. In here, it can't turn. You want to fight a stalker beast in a 2-meter gap? Finn's voice cracked slightly on the last word. I want you to tag it in a 2-meter gap. I'll bring it to you. Finn stared at him. You're going to bait a predator into a dead end alone. It's not a dead end. It's a choke point. Different thing. Nayland pointed to the far side, where the ravine opened back into wider ground. You stand there. When it comes through, it'll be moving fast and straight, no room to juke, no room to pivot. One clean shot. And where will you be? Above you, on the ledge. Nayland nodded toward a shelf of rock 10 feet up the near wall, wide enough to lie flat on, close enough to drop the distress call and pull back before the beast even registered where the sound came from. You find where your advantage holds, he said, and you bring the problem there. Finn didn't answer that. He just walked to the far end of the ravine and got into position, and something in the way he did it, no more questions, no more hesitation, told Nayland the smaller cadet had decided to trust him, at least for the length of one trial. The stalker beast came through the ravine 11 minutes later, and every second of it happened faster than Nayland had planned for. He'd climbed onto the ledge and made the sound, a wounded animal cry, low and ragged, pulled from watching prey call recordings twice the night before, and the beast had answered almost immediately, which meant it had been closer than the silence suggested. 3 meters at the shoulder, armored hide the color of wet stone, forward-set eyes that found the ravine mouth and locked onto it without slowing down. It came through the gap like water forced through a pipe, fast, low, and utterly unable to turn. Finn's shot took it clean through the throat plate, the one gap in the armor Graddock's briefing had mentioned, and every other cadet had apparently forgotten by the time they were standing in front of something this size. The beast's momentum carried it 2 more meters before it dropped, and then the ravine went quiet again, the same smooth silence as before, except now it meant something different. Finn was breathing hard, weapon still raised, staring at the downed animal like he didn't fully believe it. We're the only pair that's tagged one today. I heard 3 other teams on comms. Nobody else has one down. Nayland dropped from the ledge, landing soft in the dust. Wasn't luck. I know it wasn't luck. That's what's bothering me. Graddock watched the footage alone that evening, in an office with the shades drawn, running it back 3 times before he finally closed the file. He'd seen 100 field trials in this canyon system. He'd never seen a cadet stop for 10 minutes doing nothing and turn out to be right about it. He sat with that thought longer than the file merited, then opened Warden Toll's shared ledger and added a second line beneath the first. He had never watched a cadet stop for 10 minutes doing nothing and be right about it. He didn't send it anywhere. He just left it there, in black text on a page that had been blank for months, and went to bed without telling anyone what he'd watched. Brawl found out about the trial by the next morning, the way everything found its way to Brawl eventually, and he didn't say a word about it to Naylin's face. He didn't need to. Naylin's gear locker was standing open when he got back from morning drills, half his kit missing, not stolen, exactly, just relocated to somewhere it would take an hour to find. His sleep rotation had been swapped on the barracks board too, moved to the worst slot, the 4-hour gap between second and third watch that left a cadet running on scraps. Finn saw it first and swore under his breath. "You want me to report it?" "No. He's going to keep doing it." "I know." Naylin knelt down and started gathering what was left in the locker, unbothered, methodical, the same way he did everything. "Let him." Finn didn't understand that answer, and Naylin didn't explain it, because the explanation wasn't something you could say out loud without giving away the shape of it. Every hour Brawl spent moving gear and swapping schedules was an hour Brawl spent thinking about Naylin instead of thinking about the war game 2 weeks out. A predictable enemy was a mapped enemy. Naylin had learned that on the frontier before he'd learned to read, and it had never once stopped being true. He found his gear by nightfall. He adjusted his sleep window around the new rotation without complaint, the way water finds the low ground without being told to. And underneath the rearranged schedule and the missing kit, something in Brawl's pattern had started to show itself. The timing, the targets, the shape of a man who solved every problem the same way because it had always worked before. Naylin started keeping notes on that pattern the same night, in the dark, on the inside of his own skull, where Brawl would never think to look. The war game briefing went up on the board 3 days later. Full cohort, prey unit versus hunter unit, 12 days of preparation before the field exercise itself. Naylin read the terrain map pinned beside it once, memorized every ridge line and dry wash on it, and walked away before anyone saw him studying it twice. Sierra caught him at the board that evening, arms crossed, watching him the way she'd watched Brawl back off in the mess hall 2 weeks before. "Your prey unit," she said. "So am I." "I know." Brawl's hunter unit, squad lead. Naylin didn't react to that, which seemed to bother her more than if he had. "You're not worried?" "I've been smaller before," he said, "in worse places than this." Sierra looked at him for a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes that hadn't been there in the mess hall. Then she nodded once, like she'd filed the answer away for later, and walked off without saying anything else, leaving Naylin standing at the board with 12 days on the clock and a squad lead who'd never once needed to think past his own strength before. 12 days. Naylin intended to use every one of them. The war game clock hit 0 at dawn, and Naylin was already 3 ridgelines deep before the horn finished sounding. He'd spent 12 days mapping ground nobody else had bothered to walk twice, every dry wash, every rock shelf wide enough to hide a person, every wind channel that would carry sound the wrong direction if you knew where to stand. Prey unit scattered at the horn, most of them running for the deepest cover they could find. Naylin went the other way, out toward open ground where the cover was thin and the running was easy, because open ground was where nobody would think to look for a low-tier cadet who'd already proven he didn't hide the way they expected. He built his first false trail within the hour, boot prints pressed deep into soft dirt heading due north, then a clean break where he doubled back through a dry creek bed that wouldn't hold a print at all. He rigged tripwire markers at 2 more junctions, cheap signal flags that would trigger false movement alerts on hunter unit trackers. By midday, he'd built 4 hours of confusion into the terrain before a single hunter had gotten close enough to matter. Brawl's squad found the North Trail by early afternoon, exactly as Naylin had planned. He watched them from a rock shelf 800 meters out, close enough to see Brawl's shoulders square up with the certainty of a man who'd never once had to double-check his own read on a situation. Predictable, still predictable. He tracked Brawl for 6 hours after that, staying always 1 ridge back, reading the squad's pattern the way he'd read the ravine's silence weeks before. Brawl liked ambush corners, tight spaces where his size became an advantage instead of a liability, and he kept steering the squad toward them, again and again, like a man walking the same well-worn groove. The rear exit of the canyon system had two approaches. Every other cadet who'd studied the terrain map had marked the front approach as the only viable one, wide, visible, defensible. Nayland had walked the back route on day 3 of the 12, at night, memorizing every foothold by touch because the terrain map hadn't bothered to draw it in detail. He came through the rear exit at dusk, when the light was worst for a Kethorn's eyes and best for a human's memory of ground he'd already walked once. Brawl never turned around. The tag landed clean between his shoulder blades, the training marker leaving a bright welt of dye across his back plating. And for one full second, the entire squad went silent, because none of them had heard Nayland approach, and none of them understood how a cadet with a below-average reaction score had just walked up behind their squad lead in broad daylight and tagged him before he'd finished turning his head. Brawl's face did something Nayland hadn't seen it do before. Not anger. Something closer to confusion, the look of a man encountering a fact his whole life hadn't prepared him to hold. How? Brawl said just that, one word flat. Nayland didn't answer. He was already 3 steps back into the tree line before Brawl's squad had finished processing what had happened, and the last thing he heard before the terrain swallowed the sound was Brawl's voice, quieter now, saying something to the squad that wasn't a joke. Sierra caught him at the equipment shed 2 days later, arms crossed, the same calculating look from the board still sitting behind her eyes. Tracking duel, she said. Canyon system, west sector, you and me. Winner picks the aftermess seating chart for a week. That's not a real stake. No, she agreed, but it'll tell me something real anyway. He said yes before he'd finished thinking it through, which wasn't like him, except that some part of him had already decided Sierra wasn't an enemy to be routed around. She was something closer to a second data point, someone worth understanding properly instead of just avoiding. The duel took 3 hours. Sierra scanned horizontal the entire time, the way most Thyron trained to, sweeping the canyon floor and the mid-height ledges with a discipline that would have caught 9 out of 10 cadets inside the first 30 minutes. Nayland spent that time redirecting her trajectory without ever letting her see the redirection happen. A disturbed patch of gravel here. A broken branch angled the wrong way there. Small false signs that pulled her half a degree off true each time, compounding until 3 hours of careful tracking had walked her almost a full kilometer from where she'd started. He tagged her on the return swing, dropping from a thermal shadow above and to her left, the one patch of canyon wall that stayed cool enough all afternoon to hide his heat signature from a scanner built to expect warmth from ground level, not from above. Sierra didn't look angry when the dye marker hit her shoulder. She looked at the wall, then up at the ledge, then laughed, not the mocking kind, the kind that meant something had clicked into place. How did you know I wouldn't detect you? You were scanning horizontal, Nayland said, dropping down beside her. I was above and left. She studied him for a long moment after that, something shifting behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, not surprise anymore, something closer to respect held carefully, like she didn't yet know what to do with it. You've been doing this since day one, reading us, all of us. Everyone reads everyone. Most people just stop looking once they've decided what they see. Braddock watched that one too, from the ridge above the canyon's south end, through a long-range scope he'd started carrying without quite admitting to himself why. He traced Sierra's route on his own tracker afterward. The slow, patient drift, degree by degree. No single push large enough to notice, until the whole path had bent a kilometer sideways without her ever feeling the turn. He didn't write anything in Toll's ledger that night. He just sat with the scope in his lap long after the canyon had gone dark, thinking about how many other patterns in that academy had been quietly, invisibly redirected without anyone noticing the moment it happened. The notice went up on the barracks board 3 mornings later, and it changed the shape of everything that came after it. Final trial, 7 hunters, 3 days, no extraction until Beacon REACHED. Nayland read it once, the way he read everything, without any visible reaction. Behind him, the barracks had gone the particular kind of quiet that meant everyone else understood exactly what this trial was for. 7 cadets, hand-picked, hunting one. The academy had never run this trial on anyone below third-year standing. The fact that it was running now on him in his 6th week wasn't an accident and wasn't hidden as one. Finn found him at the board an hour later. 7 of them, 3 days. You know what that trial's actually for, right? To see if I break. To see if you're what the intake numbers said you were. Finn's voice had an edge in it Nayland hadn't heard before. They're not testing your tracking skills anymore. They're testing the classification. If you pass this, it isn't a training result. It's evidence. Nayland looked at the board a while longer, at the 7 names listed beneath his own. Brawl's name first among them, squad lead again, exactly as expected. He thought about the field bag under his bunk frame, still not fully unpacked 6 weeks in. The way it had sat since the first night, he'd walked the room and learned its exits. Then I'd better not break, he said, and walked away to start planning. Nayland entered the deep preserve at sunrise on the first day of the final trial, and he didn't do the thing every hunter watching the perimeter feeds expected him to do. He didn't run for cover. He walked out along the open eastern ridge, where the ground was bare rock and low scrub, no shadow deep enough to hide a house cat, let alone a grown man. 7 hunters had deployed at first light, spread across the preserve's entry points, and every one of them had studied the same terrain map Nayland had studied for 12 days before the war game. Every one of them expected the smallest, weakest-rated cadet in academy history to bolt for the densest cover available and stay there. He gave them open ground instead. He gave them nothing to read. Brawl's squad reassembled for this trial. 5 hunters strong, Brawl still leading despite the welt of dye that had taken 2 days to wash off his back plating, held the eastern approach for 4 hours, watching the ridge, waiting for him to break toward cover the way every instinct said he should. He never did. By the time they finally moved to sweep the ridge directly, Nayland had already dropped into a dry gully a kilometer back, one that ran underground through soft ground nobody had bothered to map because it didn't look like it went anywhere. It went everywhere. He'd walked it twice at night during the 12 days before the war game, memorizing the soft turns by feel, the same way he'd once learned every aurora on a frontier world where the things that hunted you didn't announce themselves either. By the second day, 3 of the 7 hunters had lost his trail entirely and hadn't recovered it. 2 more had wasted 6 hours converging on a false camp he'd built and abandoned before dawn, cold coals, a boot print pressed just deep enough to look recent, nothing else. Somewhere on the surface above him, on the 3rd night, he heard Brawl's voice carry down through a crack in the rock, tight with something that wasn't the certainty from 6 weeks ago. He's not hiding, Brawl said to someone Nayland couldn't see. He's not even trying to hide. He's just gone, like the ground ate him. The ground hadn't eaten him. The ground had simply told him where to go, the way it always did, if you stopped long enough to ask it properly. He crossed back into open terrain at the start of the 3rd night, moving along the same eastern ridge he'd used on day 1, because a place already searched and cleared was the last place anyone would think to search again. The extraction beacon sat 2 kilometers north, a single blinking light on a plateau nobody had bothered guarding heavily, since nobody expected him to reach it from this direction, or this early, or at all. He reached it at 31 minutes past the 29th hour. The fastest previous completion of that trial in the Academy's recorded history was 44 hours. The comms officer at the beacon station didn't say anything for a long moment after confirming his tag. He just stared at the timestamp on the console, then radioed it in twice, like he thought the number might change the second time. The final assembly happened 2 mornings later, in the main hall, every cadet in the cohort standing in formation, while Graddock read down a list of names and times, flat, the way he read everything. He got to the bottom of the list last. Thorn, 29 hours, 31 minutes. He didn't add anything to it. No comment, no aside. But the pause after the number ran about a second longer than any other pause in the whole recitation, and in a hall that size, with that many predator ears trained to catch the smallest shift in another creature's breathing, a second was a very loud silence. Brawl stood near the front of the formation, arms crossed, staring at a fixed point on the far wall. His 312 wins meant something different in that silence than they had 6 weeks ago. Not erased. Just no longer the only number anyone in that hall was thinking about. Warden Tolles sat in his office that same afternoon, the ledger open in front of him, 2 lines already written, and no more room needed for a third. He read both lines again, the one about the 10 minutes, the one about the footage nobody thought to explain, and then set the ledger aside and pulled a formal document toward him instead. He didn't need the ledger anymore. He had something better than notes now. He had a number the whole academy had watched happen in real time. He wrote one sentence, sealed it, and sent it to the Galactic Conclave's Military Oversight Board before he'd finished his tea. The human species has been misclassified. Across the galaxy, in an office that smelled nothing like Vorath's hot metal air, a duty officer read the message twice, checked the attached trial data once, and forwarded it with a single line of his own. Recommend immediate classification review. The barracks felt different that final week, though nobody could have said exactly when the change happened. Cadets who'd walked past Nayland without seeing him for 6 weeks now gave him a half-step of space in the hallway, the kind of space you gave something you'd stopped being sure you understood. Brawl's corner of the mess hall stayed his corner. Nobody challenged that. But the way his squad watched Nayland cross the room had changed its shape entirely. It wasn't sizing up a target anymore. It was something more careful than that, the look of hunters who had finally noticed they'd been the ones being read the whole time. Finn found him at the bunk the night before the transport left, watching him fold a jacket he'd worn for 6 weeks without once fully settling into the room. "You never unpacked," Finn said, not a question. "Didn't need to." Sierra appeared in the doorway a moment later, arms crossed, the same calculating look from the tracking duel, except softer now, worn down into something closer to fondness. "Graddock's putting your trial data in the training curriculum. Next year's cohort is going to study how you read that ravine." Nayland folded the jacket once more, corner to corner, and set it on top of the bag that had sat under his bunk frame since the first night he'd walked the room and learned every exit in it by feel. "They should study the ground," he said. "I just listened to it." He was asleep before the transport left Vorath's gravity well, boots still on, the field bag beside him half open the way it had been for 6 weeks, because some habits didn't unpack, just because the reason for them had finally been proven right. On the plateau below, Sierra stood at the gate long after the ship had cleared the ridgeline, and didn't say anything to anyone about why she stayed there watching the sky. Somewhere else in the galaxy, a message sat in a queue awaiting review, 1 sentence long, already changing the shape of things nobody at Vorath Academy would ever get to see. Nobody had expected that. Nobody had expected any of this.